We'd like to welcome you to this session on multimodal transportation systems for smart cities. If you did not expect to be here because it was announced as being in another room, the doors are locked now, so you can't so welcome. You know, this topic isn't clear. We don't know exactly what this topic is. We don't know whether this means how do you get that first mile to get on that other mode and then get on something else to get on another mode, and do you have to pay for each of them separately, or can you do that all at once? Or does it mean how do you make multimodal systems attractive, economical, efficient, or does it mean something else entirely? Does it mean do we need entirely different systems for the way people get around? And that's what we're here to talk about today in about 40 minutes. So we have 5 very, very distinguished panelists. They have biographies that are in your program. Dan Sturgis is been in the transportation design business for 35 years and done everything from cars to literally transportation systems. Marcia Wellborn was the chief planner at the MTA for a number of years, has most recently been working for Disney, and is trained as an architect and urban designer at Harvard and MIT. Willie Tesser has been in Southern California doing things forever and is also trained as an urban planner and architect at both at UCLA and USC. I don't know how you get away with that. But,
in the fall, I divide my loyalties.
And Small is the vice mayor of Culver City and an architect by training. And
no, that's actually not true, but it's okay.
I'm an honorary architect.
Honorary architect, okay. Honorary. And last but not least, Peter Marks said he wants to introduce himself.
So my name is Peter Marks. I'm faculty at USC, executive at General Electric, and the former CTO for the city of LA. So I'll leave it there.
So,
and I sleep across the pillow from an architect.
It's a small architecture.
And in my business, we say you have a right to remain silent. So it's an exciting topic. It's an exciting panel, and we're going to start off with Mr. Sturgis and have him talk about multimodal transportation systems for smart cities.
So stand up there? Or?
No, stay here. We don't have enough time.
All right. I don't know if you can hear me okay. So I'm honored to talk in front of this amazing panel, and I think we're all pretty different, which is exciting. I guess the word happier is not it's all about how we're going to create a healthier and happier world. And obviously, transportation, a new paradigm of transportation is a pretty big deal. I mean, the Model T Ford was the last big mobility paradigm. And I go to conferences, sometimes they say cars are evil, and I say, well, before the Model T, the average American never went more than 25 miles from when they were born their entire life. So I think cars have actually done a pretty good thing. But there's this externality problem we're dealing with. And ultimately, it's really about it's really not transportation we're talking about access. We're talking about the future of mobility, that's physical movement and connectivity access. So I actually started as a car designer, so when I started talking about right-sizing mobility, and early in my career, I made a kind of a golf cart car. You may have seen a kind of oval-looking thing, and it has 5 horsepower. So there's people in Santa Monica using my little vehicle to go to the store, and they're not using 500 horsepower, they're using 5 horsepower. And when I start talking to people that are car-oriented, they don't know how to think about our cities, and so I had to coin these terms. So I've coined the term thick city and thin city. So we're in thick city right now, very tall buildings, and thin cities like suburban Orange County, and Metro can't make systems in thin cities very easily without first and last mile solutions to it. And I've also been to conferences and people start talking about the Hyperloop. And so I've actually started to use this term. I'm sorry there's no PowerPoint for me here, but it's like you're gonna have to use your imagination for a second. But when I get into this conversation about the Hyperloop, it's like what problem we're trying to solve. You know, if you can go from downtown LA to San Francisco in 30 minutes for lunch, but it takes 2 hours to drive to Anaheim at night, what problem are we trying to solve? And I really think we need to make our mega regions and our regions really awesome places to live. So I've actually had to create this tier system, so bear with me. So the car that you probably own, I call it a tier 2 vehicle. It goes 70 miles an hour, and you drive it around Denver or down around LA or around Tampa, Florida. We don't really use our freeway cars to drive to other states, but we can. And then I would call the Jet or the Hyperloop a tier 3 vehicle. It goes 500 miles an hour. So you're national or global, tier 3. Our cars are tier 2, and what we're really missing is tier 1, like a bicycle. In LA here, we have less than 2% mode share of bicycles, even though it's like Shangri-La weather, and people in Norway are 40% and it's snowing. So I try to figure out how to get smaller micromobility vehicles into our cities, so we have tier 3, tier 2, tier 1. And so I call the light, low-speed modes of these new little vehicles, and then the fast, heavy cars, fast, heavy vehicles we have. And part of this is not just about how our new transportation system is going to be, but it's how we create it. So the digital revolution is not just about how we move in a new way, but it's how we create it. And so I made this golf cart car company called GemCar, but I don't want to make another one. I would much rather go to Long Beach and see some young people invent their little local transportation. I'd love to see them create a vehicle. And with the outreach ways that we do outreach, instead of having the community say, I have a good plan for bike lanes, I'd love to see the people in our cities start to be a part of creating this new transportation system with us. So Metro's the best ever that we've ever had. So Metro's great. We have bike share now, we have car share. We have smartphone taxis all across our city. I mean, you call them TNCs, I guess, but I just call them smartphone taxis, and I don't think LA ever had a good taxi service. Now we have Uber, Lyft, which is awesome. We have FaceTime, Skype, teleaccess, and while a lot of our conversations about retrofitting our cities and how we can have more appropriate local transportation, I think there's also an opportunity to create a new small city, like go up to Lancaster and make a place from scratch where big cars don't come in the center. I actually give Playa Vista a pretty bad grade because they bring these freeway cars in the center, and then the places you walk are these teeny little strips because they keep packaging freeway cars into our downtown. So we also have the Waymo autonomous cars coming. Uber's talking about flying us from Irvine up to Thousand Oaks in the future without any pilot. That's going to be interesting. We have little mobility robots following us down the streets, they say. We will have those or whatever. Elon Musk wants to dig tunnels. We've got high-speed rail. We've got opportunities of autonomous vehicles going down special lanes on our freeways at 100 miles an hour, Amazon delivery drones, and all this stuff. And yet the consumer in here, I think we all need a financial education, because a lot of us have heard that a car is $8,500 to own or maintain. If you have a house with 2 newer cars, that's $17,000 a year. That's about $48, $50 a day. So if the car man came to your house Monday night and you had to pay $50, and then the next night, $50, and you're like, whoa, this is a lot of money. And then Saturday you think you're gonna have relief, and the Netflix is playing, they want their $50. I mean, it's insane how much money we're paying for this stuff. So we need to figure out the big user case, how can you start having a one-car challenge? How can we starting car reduction in our city? And how do we move past car ownership? Because so much good stuff happens when we don't own cars. And you just take 5% of the cars off the 405 and speeds can go up 50%. I mean, we can do it. We've got all this stuff going on, but we've got to think creatively, and we've got to invent the way we do this as much as the future we go to. So that's my setup for a conversation, I guess.
So lots of out-of-the-box possibilities. Martha, you've been doing this for a very long time and are the architect of not only plans for transportation systems, but for things like Union Station, although stay tuned on getting that implemented. But
Right.
what do you think?
I think that's inspiring, Dan, as you always are. I'm the practical person. Well, you guys are probably practical too. I don't know, but compared to Dan, I'm on the practical implementation side, because what I'm all about, what most architects are all about, is actually getting stuff built. And my scale tends to be, the next level up, more the urban scale. And so I've worked both in transportation and in larger land use projects. But I love the vision. I think I love the compliment to Metro, even though I'm not working there at the moment. And it's really true. There has never been a better time for Metro. They have so much money right now. It's like a feeding frenzy over there, although all that money is very highly spoken for. They now have 4 half-cent sales taxes coming in to the tune of $3 billion per year for very specific transit and even including highway projects, because a good portion of the county, LA Metro is a county-wide agency, and a good portion of the county doesn't have transit and probably won't, or it's road operated rather than rail operated. But I think one thing we can't lose sight of are the practical problems of getting the stuff actually built, and the realities of boards and politicians and political will. And I mean, one example is I first ran into Dan when I was working in the very early days of BRT, bus rapid transit, borrowing ideas from Brazil, bringing them up here. And initially, even on the first plane ride, I took a small delegation of politicians. This is the very first delegation I took down there on the plane on the way back. And I had in that group the Bus Riders Union, as well as some state transportation officials, the head of the FTA at the time. It was a small delegation, a deputy mayor. Anyway, everybody was convinced what we saw in Brazil made sense, and they started drawing routes on napkins on the plane on the way back. Eventually, we got the two quasi-BRT lines, the Wilshire route, the 720, and the Ventura route, up and running at the same time that the Red Line was finally extended to the San Fernando Valley. But the goal was that those bus lines should be in their dedicated lanes in the center of the street, and then they could zip down the street as if they were light rail. They're just on rubber tires. It took, I mean, the only one that actually operates that way is now the Orange Line. That's in its own dedicated line. It took Metro and all of us another at least 12 years. I'd have to add up the actual years to get even a section of Wilshire in a dedicated line to for the 720 to operate. And it's still partial because it was a grant to the city from the feds, and we rushed the grant in, and Beverly Hills, we didn't have time to coordinate with Beverly Hills, so it goes through LA, stops at Beverly Hills, picks up again when Wilshire gets back into LA. So I would just urge, we all need to think about and not forget that implementation is a phase we have to think about, and it's a phase I'm not afraid of. I actually love that realm of work. Getting things actually done is intensely satisfying because we're here. Your initial goals are exactly right. A better, healthier, happier place. Is that what you said? Yeah. So, but unless you get it built, you can't really realize that. So I'm here to answer all your practical questions.
So, Woody, what do you think about all this?
I'm going to take it a little bit different level because I don't believe it's just about transportation. I think we fail to acknowledge the inextricable relationship between mobility, transportation, and land use, how we physically develop our communities. Because ultimately it's about the livability, it's about the quality of life, it's about the economy, it's about the equity among our communities themselves. If you think historically about how our patterns are developed in the United States, you take a look at a map of Boston in its early settlements. The patterns of streets, the patterns of development were related to the horse and carriage, the actual movement from place to place. It's not a grid. It's a really interesting fragmented series, especially today, trying to get around Boston. But the shape and form of the community based upon commerce and based upon living, based upon culture, was indeed by that connectivity among the various land uses, et cetera. And there was a natural, if you will, symbiosis between the actual patterns of development and transportation. You look at the earliest settlements of Southern California, and we had a red line. We had one of the most sophisticated in the United States at the time, one of the most robust transportation systems. In the early settlements of Southern California, we developed cities. We had a downtown, but we also had a Pasadena. We had a San Bernardino. We had nodes of activity that were places that were tied to that red car transit system that was developed in Southern California. So again, there was this relationship which then through actions of our friends in Detroit and other locations and political actions basically shifted away, and we destroyed that system and built the freeway system, a concept of a 4-mile grid overlaying Southern California. And what happened over time, those distinct places, there were communities along that red line system filled in. You had the intersections and the spaces between that grid, never completely fully developed, but we filled up that land, and it inextricably, once again, transportation changed the pattern of development we have in Southern California. And after a period of time, I think we all recognized that that pattern of use had its problems, especially we filled up all those intersections of the grids of the freeway system. We filled it up and we created the problems and resulted in the problems of congestion and air quality pollution and greenhouse gas emissions and all the inextricable problems, the social cultural problems that surface with that kind of development. So we recognized that while we were shaping development for transportation, we were having problems as a result of how we were doing it as well. So we began to think more about transit. Of course, we had at the time rubber wheel form of public transit, which used the same kind of corridors that we had for the automobile system. There was no attempt to really, truly, at that period of time, separate it as well. But we began to say, hey, we got to do things differently. And the robust metro system, when you think about it, is really an interesting opportunity to go back and think about that relationship between land use development and the patterns of development. Our real problem, this is a real fundamental problem that we haven't completely solved, is we're overlaying the metro grid onto an existing pattern of communities. There are places where the stations, it's not as if we're out in Lancaster or Palmdale, where we can develop a planned community oriented and focusing land uses around the transportation system. This is the transportation system that's getting overlaid on neighborhoods and districts and corridors, and many of those station locations, because we're looking at the easiest routes, the cheapest routes. The Blue Line was on an existing rail line, or the Gold Line to and from Pasadena was on what had been a rail line, et cetera. What we're recognizing that some of the stations, would it be in the kind of locations where the land uses are that we would develop now on a more thoughtful planned development, where many of the stations are on single-family neighborhoods? I think of the stations in Pasadena, and only one, in reality, maybe two, out of the 5 stations is on an area where there is some relationship possibility of mixed use and density, et cetera. So that creates problems as we think about adding to this system, and then we complement that by adding these other overlays. First mile, last mile, because we also recognize very clearly that we can't have the station built in isolation. We have to get to and from the station, be it by bicycle, be it by pedestrian, be it by other forms of transit, microtransit or shuttles or whatever kind of other movement. That also overlays onto an existing pattern of development. I think most of you in the room are probably familiar with Measure S. We've had the reaction. So this notion that we planners and urban designers believe in is creating great places around the transit stations often comes into a buzzsaw. Partially, I would contend, as an architect and urban designer by training, that we haven't necessarily designed them very well. I think there's a missing piece of quality in terms of the type of places that we're trying to create around, but we create a Measure S situation where the public rejects. It's not just a NIMBYism. In effect, it's saying we're not doing it right. And it's a concern that I think all of us in this room need to confront as we add to these other pieces of mobility that we've been talking about here. As we add autonomous vehicles, which is even going to have a more significant effect than lots of discussion of what are the urban form and community patterns of land use relationships to this, we haven't quite solved that. And I think we need, if we're really seriously going to make alternative forms of transportation, non-automobile form of transportation work, we need to give better, careful thinking about how we weave the pieces together, how we use the places of the intersections of where these modes come together, and think about how we plan those better than we necessarily have been planning them to date. I don't need to go through, some of us have worked in Santa Monica. I see some friends here from Santa Monica. We've had some issues with, yes, maybe downtown, Bergamot did not work, et cetera, for those of us who were involved in that effort. Which was painful. But I think the whole notion of thinking about place, thinking about community, thinking about scales that also are not one size fits all. I worked on a transit-oriented community plan for Jefferson La Cienega Station. We had high fives from a really hostile community as we walked out of the room, because we actually carefully considered mix of uses and densities that transitioned with a joining neighborhood. What was the first proposal First proposal was for, in an area that's predominantly 1 and 2 stories adjacent to Culver City, a 30-story residential tower on a podium piece of architecture, where the original plan called for breaking that site up into a smaller street-level grid that was more pedestrian-oriented with the same quantities of land use. So I think we need to get back to some really careful planning. Maybe it's not prescriptive, but at least setting some places, some principles about how pieces fit together. It's not just the transit, it's not just the land use, but how do these truly intersect, come together?
And Woody, you are involved in transit-oriented development for the high-speed rail, are you
Yes.
not?
We're working on the Palmdale-Burbank segment and on the stations for Palmdale and Burbank, and they're two radically different models, because when we do have the desert environment where you have the opportunity to, I will say create from scratch, but in effect have that opportunity to basically superimposing another station on top of an area where the Burbank airport is and integrating that in with the sort of same considerations as well.
So there is a lot of movement towards transit-oriented development, and Thomas, you're doing that in Culver City with pretty high marks so far. Can you talk to us about that and what else you think?
Well, I hope we earn our high marks. And in Culver City, we definitely are at, on the leading edge or the bleeding edge of these issues in multimodal mobility and in the problems that force us there and in the problems of trying to implement them. Along with my conference buddy Pam O'Connor from Santa Monica out there, we're concerned about, as we talked this morning in the autonomous vehicle session, about electric scooters lying around and tunnels being dug under our streets. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the stage that we're at now in Culver City, but not too much so that we can return to talking about Culver City as sort of a case study or something that's happening right now as we get into questions and discussion amongst the panel. But we Culver City, and Woody reminds me how much the history of a place is important in trying to understand these things, because Culver City was founded about 100 years ago by an entrepreneur named Harry Culver, and his saying was that all roads lead to Culver City. And that was literally true then, and it's kind of literally true now, because you have Cheviot Hills on the north, and you have Baldwin Hills on the south, and if you want to get to Santa Monica or Venice from downtown, you pretty much got to go through Culver City, and it's always been that way. The Red Line went through Culver City when we had the first train system in LA. The 10 freeway goes through Culver City. The creek, the LA River originally went through Culver City before it moved, and Ballona Creek goes through Culver City now. And so the main thoroughfares, the 10, Washington Boulevard, Venice Boulevard, all go through Culver City, and they all get terribly clogged up, as we all know. And so while I'm not an architect, I'm a big fan of architects, and have worked with architects for the last 20 years or so as a writer and consultant. So when I ran for office, I had an unusual approach in that I was kind of the architect's candidate, and the design community was sort of my base, and I ran on a platform of what excellence in design can bring to a city. And the interesting way that translated to a general public was, what are we going to get from designing the city better? We're going to get less traffic. And so I was the less traffic candidate. So I kind of had a mandate when I was elected to work on that. And so we launched a visioning process and study for our transit-oriented district, because that's where the car traffic has become the worst, is right around where our train station is at National in Washington. So that was a very satisfying and successful project. We worked on that. We had lots of excellent consultants who applied for that RFP, and we picked a great team, an international team, partly with a mobility firm based in London. And we really came to understand the city then, and how its grid of streets are what caused the problem. Because with these different modes of transportation over the years, we don't have a rational grid. We have a number of different grids that overlay each other and end up with a lot of streets that don't connect. And that helps in some landlocked neighborhoods. So and we were really pushed to this the point of starting that study because there was a landlocked neighborhood that could not get out of their neighborhood. That took them, 40 minutes to drive their kids to school, in rush hour, where it would take 5 minutes if they're not in rush hour. So where we got to throughout that process was it was fascinating to see it happen in real time too, because as it was happening, all these issues, even over the last it's been about a year ago that we started this, things have changed really rapidly, even in this last year. So we arrived at a point that I think most people in this part of the hotel on this day would understand of wanting to get away from the car, lessen parking, increase density around transit, and have complete streets with protected bike lanes on each side, and perhaps narrow the streets a little, and less. I'll look out for the lightning that may strike. The term road diet that we don't use anymore. and so right while we were doing that, what what we refer to as the Mike Bonin debacle and the Mike Bonin effect happened, and right down the street from us, and we sort of realized, no, we can't even talk about this hardly. And the guy who was head of our bike program went to work for Mike Bonin, and he said he can't use the word bike for the next 2 years.
It's like the trouble in the distribution.
So at the stage that we're at, we kind of realized at that moment that was happening, that a big part of the reason why there was such a tremendous backlash is because we don't have good multimodal alternatives yet in LA. And everybody says we're not New York, we don't have a good subway system. This is what all my residents say, so you guys can't do any of that stuff. Until you build all those trains everywhere, then, you'll pry my steering wheel from my cold, dead hands. So we realized that we needed to have an alternative in place. That if we're going to slow down the streets and do traffic calming, that there's got to be another way for that soccer mom to get her kids to karate downtown and then pick the other one up at the soccer field that afternoon. That when we saw that eruption, we realized, no, that we cannot move forward with this. So that really made us focus on this concept of on-demand micro-transit, which we're working on now, but it's very challenging. My transportation director says that he cannot lose money, tons of money, for 10 years like Uber. That if we're going to have a municipal type Uber, it has to be, and if we're going to do a pilot of it, we have to be sure that it's not going to instantly get overwhelmed and not work. So that's the stage we're at right now. We're taking it. It's the report has been finished, and we're trying to move into implementation. We all desperately don't want it to be something that just sits on a shelf. What did I hear the other day? Vision without, there's a word for vision without resources. It's called hallucination. And that's not what I want to have spent that $800,000 on. As was also discussed a little bit this morning, we also had the Boring Company come to our council meeting last week and make a presentation about how they want to dig tunnels under our roads and create a private public transportation
Are they
system.
doing that with flamethrowers? Is that what
Yes, and they're financing it with flamethrowers and hats. So I'll leave it there and on to Peter.
So we're trying to talk about multimodal transportation systems for smart cities. I think we all think we live in smart cities, but I'm not even sure what that is because we didn't define that at the beginning. But Peter,
Yeah.
you have some thoughts about all this?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So just by way of background, I'm a third generation Angelino. My parents were here during the red cars and watched them go away, if you will. And how many people here ride a bike every week? Anybody? Every week. How many people ride them every day? Okay, so there's a few of us, right? So how many people feel safe riding a bicycle in LA? Oh, interesting. So it's funny because even the two of us, put our hands down, if you will. And I do a lot of bicycle riding. How many people here have a smartphone? Anybody? Oh, come on. There's at least one person who doesn't have a smartphone.
That's the question.
Okay. What are your cars doing right now? What are your automobiles doing right now? Anybody?
Lying dead.
Yeah. Anybody? Is your automobile? And I assume everybody has an automobile. Is your automobile doing anything useful right now? Yeah, that's probably the problem, right? So I come from the digital space, and even though I love design, love architecture, I even love an architect. The fact of the matter is that in the physical world, everything is very slow moving. I've been waiting for the ability for myself to be able to ride to my alma mater, UCLA, on the subway. I'm not even sure that I'll be alive when it's finally done. I hope it will, because I think the Olympics will probably speed it up. But the fact of the matter is that changing the physical space is one of those things that is very gradual. Whereas, obviously, in the digital world, things are happening exceedingly rapidly. And one of the fascinating things that I just heard from our panel discussion here is that people mentioned Uber and things like that, but nobody mentioned the fact that digital is rapidly changing mobility at a faster rate and a more dramatic rate way than really anything that we've been able to do with land use and policy and all the rest of it. And I'll use a couple examples. So I was the CTO for Garcetti, and we launched an open data portal where we published a lot of the data from the transportation system. My favorite is that we publish every day the parking citations. Because I wanted somebody to do that app, what are my chances? Should I pay the meter? And people, by the way, have. And in addition, obviously, that data drives a lot of things, because while Metro publishes its bus schedules, the real-time locations of the buses themselves are only just now becoming available. There are something like 60 different bus companies across the LA region. There's a gazillion different options for mobility. But nowhere are they actually tied together, right? They don't have a single payment system. TAP is a great idea, but it's trapped inside of the Roach Motel called Cubic, and my apologies to anybody from Cubic here, which makes it uninteroperable with anything else. And so we tried something under Garcetti, which is that we worked with Xerox to do a mobility marketplace called GoLA, where we put about 35 different mobility options into an app that anybody could use, and it allow you to go between any two places in LA. And you could see all of your options based upon cost, time, and we're in California, sustainability. How much do you have to eat, how many calories do you need, and how much CO2 will you produce as you get across the city. And ultimately, Xerox ended up pulling the app because there wasn't very much usage. People were really tied to their automobiles and their patterns of behavior. But meanwhile, I spent a lot of time overseas. I spent a lot of time in Singapore, Riyadh, across China, Europe, you name it, right? And in the time that we've been talking about things here in Los Angeles, the changes in China are unbelievable. I used to run R&D for Qualcomm, the chip company that does, the chips inside of all your smartphones. And we have an R&D group. We had an R&D group in Beijing. I was in Beijing, and I saw this amazing app about 6 years ago, which allowed me to literally say, I want to get across Beijing. And it would say, okay, go to the corner, get on the second bus, okay, wait, get off at that stop, walk across the street, do this, all the rest of it. And we in the time that people have been doing that in China, obviously China has built high-speed rail, has built a crazy amount of subway, has done both docked and dockless bicycles. They've done multi-payment systems. Everything is available through WeChat. The data is transparent. And I bring this up not because I'm particularly pro-China. I'm completely terrified of the fact that we're competing with them, because we really have to get off our duff. And we have to move from our silos, which are really these governmental agencies, in a different place than the commercial world, and the urban planners and the architects in a different place than the programmers and the software folks, and really start to look at mobility in a much more holistic way. You know, what happened with Mike Bonin, with Councilman Bonin and road diets was really a tragedy. I think a lot of people would agree with that. And part of it was because, you know, my theory is that, quite frankly, we imposed it, but we didn't do the requisite marketing around it, if you will. And again, I think the digital world offers a lot for us to be able to do this. And I'll leave it there.
So, Dan, you came up with a vision of what it might be out there in a multimodal way, and you've now heard from people that have been doing this for a long time and with a pretty visionary thing and doing very good work. What are your responses? What's your reaction?
Well, everyone's incredibly smart, and it's incredibly complex. You know, for my 30 years when I started in these little vehicles, I'm seeing so many articles today about self-driving cars and about the future. The articles I'm not seeing is of how cities are getting rid of car ownership. I'm not seeing a huge defection. I see companies come to LA and they piecemeal offer a new car share service, or Metro focuses on what they're doing, but it's all kind of, you know, like, let's add this in the bucket, let's add this, but we don't seem to really focus on, like, the car users and say, okay, what's a big group we could focus on with the car users? What's the largest user group? And I would say it's probably the commuter. It's the second car in the house that goes to a consistent work site every 5 days. And you don't go to a house with two traveling real estate agents that have to go all parts of LA every day. They need their cars. But can we make the commute better? Could you have a little electric bike to get you down to a place to ride a van? How come the van isn't like a business class van? Why is it we're taking people that have this huge footprint with a car and pushing them into like a super shuttle vehicle, like little ants, and uncomfortable? We don't think about how to make this a nicer thing. And now with Uber Lyft, theoretically, if you miss the van going home, now with Uber and Lyft, you can get home. So we need, I think, to be thinking about how to reduce car ownership. You know, you don't say car reduction to the consumer, but you talk about a better quality of life, cutting their cost of ownership of cars in half maybe by having a mobility bundle. But we have to work together in an integrated, you know, like a coalition, and focus on, there's actually services that'll tell you who's moving where in the city, like AirStage. They'll tell you where you have a bunch of commuters, let's say down by Redondo Beach, and where they're all going to a workplace, maybe in Long Beach or up in downtown LA. And we just haven't gotten there. It's just all very piecemeal. So I'm just hopeful that we work across. I mean, Dan Sperling, who's the head of the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis and on the California Resources Board, he hired me 20 years ago as a car designer to come in and walk the halls of University of California Institute of Transportation, and just to start reaching across the aisle and working more together with people you don't know. I came from the car design world, and my friend Grant Larson's a fancy Porsche designer, and he's friends with Jerry Seinfeld and stays at his Hamptons house, and he makes all this money designing beautiful Porsches. But if you ask him what a transportation planner is, he has no idea. And so, you know, that's this world that we need to start figuring out.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, having come out of the tech world, I spent a lot of time with autonomous vehicle technology folks and robotics folks. None of them have ever met anybody from urban planning and don't know anything about how governments work. They're in a completely different universe, if you will. And one of the things that we did was that we actually had the Google X team come down and do a presentation on what they were doing with self-driving vehicles. This is now, I don't know, 3.5 years ago, something like that, early days. And it was fascinating because the entire city of LA, if we had Culver City, they would have been there too. But the city of LA leadership was there and riveted, if you will. And the advantages of self-driving cars are sort of manifest, right? Safety, efficiency, turn it into a service, sustainability things and all the rest of it. The labor displacement side of it is an unsolved issue. And that's going to be the thing that's going to come back and really bite us, if you will. And I think that, to Dan's point, I don't think governments are really that well positioned to get people out of their cars. But I think that car manufacturers and mobility providers, and they're all focused on self-driving cars. I mean, I'll give you an analogy. How many people here can fly without an airplane? Let's just like go up in the air and fly. Anybody? All right. Well,
I want to meet that person.
yeah, exactly. So we all get onto airliners. We all get onto airplanes. They have 3 autopilots and 2 human pilots. The human pilots are there to feed the autopilots. And in flying, even though none of us can physically fly, is safer than us walking around the city of LA. And I just want to point out that the technology issues are entirely solvable. We've already demonstrated over and over again that we can make things safer and more efficient and better and all the rest of it. Now the challenge is going to be for the policy folks to figure out what to do with this when this stuff comes, because my crystal ball doesn't work. But my guess is that self-driving cars will do the classic hockey stick. There'll be a few crazy people do them first, and then boom, it'll go vertical, and we will all find ourselves doing it. So.
We've got a couple minutes left. I'm going to open it up for questions in the audience, so please.
So my question is, when you talk about trying to get people out of their cars, anecdotally, I'm around a lot of young people. I have a 17-year-old son. When I turned 16, the day I turned 16, in a blizzard in Detroit, I went and got my driver's license. I see over half of the 17 to 29-year-olds in my sphere, in places that don't have good transportation, not wanting a driver's license, not caring about it, and honestly, not even caring about how they get from A to B, because they just assume there's going to be something there.
They have this.
They have this.
Right.
So, and yet I'm looking at this, a really knowledgeable panel, thinking about how do we change minds. Is it really just letting the next generation take on? Because we don't even have, I don't have a day job that makes me commute from A to B on straight pattern every single day. Most people don't anymore. So, just how do you look at clothes and then layer on planning on top of it?
I mean, I was on a different panel yesterday. Yesterday I came down, I took a lift over to the Wilshire Western Purple Line, came down here, had a completely easy experience, and it cost me, I don't know, $7, something like that, each way. Today I drove myself. Parking, I'll just leave it there.
It's funny because you hear this all the time, and the actual data about what you're commenting on anecdotally, I think may be the other direction. I read I'm trying to remember where I read this article, but just in the last couple of days, maybe it was the New York Times, that they're finding that the latest generation doesn't have cars. Didn't get cars mostly because of the recession, because they couldn't afford it, and there weren't jobs for them. And that now they're finding that as they get older, they are buying cars. So that's one thing that I think we should check on. But the other thing that's even more striking that I have to deal with almost on a daily basis is that I find that while all of us planner-oriented folks want to move to this next stage, it's really hard to get the business people to move there, and the developers. We have a project that's going to be a fabulous project. That's a new market hall, sort of a Grand Central Market or Eataly type thing out on Washington Boulevard, and it's pretty transit rich there. The light rail doesn't go there, but the owner is a large mall owner, national mall owner, a huge company, and I could not with a crowbar pry a parking space out of them. We wanted to underpark it. They wouldn't do it. They were ready to walk. And it was the same thing with most of the neighbors, which was I found even more bizarre, that they're so terrified of people coming and parking on their street in front of their house and taking up their parking, that they want us to build this monstrous parking structure that everybody in this room will tell you is going to be obsolete in a few years. But so where it's a rocky, tough transition when you're right in the trenches right now.
Quickly, and I'm coming back to land use and how we shape our communities. Worked in Pasadena on the most recent iteration of the general plan, and we're now involved in the implementation of that general plan. One of the things we learned very early is if you live in the core district of Pasadena, there is a 36% per capita less VMT than if you live, let's say, up by the Rose Bowl or in the more suburban, if you will, parts of Pasadena. Why is that? Yes, partially to transit, but also because of the mix and density of uses that have been developed around those transit stations. Because they still may commute that one trip per day to and from their job elsewhere, but they're reducing their other trips because they can walk to the grocery market, because they can walk to a Laemmle movie theater or a Blockbuster showing movie theater. They can walk to a great series of restaurants. We had some conversations about the development community. You know, well, why did this mix of use happen in Pasadena? It just wasn't regulation. But why it happened was the sense that there was going to be a transit alternative in Pasadena. If you look at the ridership for the Gold Line, it's not huge. It doesn't match the numbers of the people who live in downtown Pasadena. But there's been a significant, like the Olympics, when we were able to cut off the peak of the trips, they've effectively done that in Pasadena because they were looking at how these pieces marry and how they connect to transit stations for those who do want the option. And I guess it wasn't everybody who lives in core downtown Pasadena. I think there's a notion and a misunderstanding by some of the, quote, NIMBYs that we're trying to force people to all live in that kind of environment. It's just saying that there are some people out there who truly want that choice to live in that kind of environment. And I suspect, as one of the gentlemen in the community said at a public meeting, he said, I'm not trying to take away your green single-family house, cottage that you have in Pasadena. I just want to have a choice for me that's different, and I choose to have something different.
And we are unfortunately out of time, and so we'll have to move on. I want to thank our panelists, Dan, Martha, Woody, Thomas, and Peter, for a good job. Multimodal transit systems for smart cities. What we've learned is that it ain't easy. So thanks for coming.